Thank you folks for having me here and taking up your afternoon. I appreciate your willingness to listen to the work that I'm doing. So we'll go for about an hour and then we'll give a half hour for questions. It should be ample time. So won't be able to read anything or comments in the chat box until then because my eyes will be focused on my screen. So I want to talk about this issue of equity in our cities, our neighborhoods, and it's a persistent problem, and it seems to be affecting a lot of ways in which neighborhoods can actually survive crises. And so I want to share some thoughts with you on how to approach the way to rethink the way we revitalize our neighborhoods. And my focus is on neighborhoods, being an urban sociologist. Okay, so first, hopefully we can look at energy as a function of urban planning, because the urban planning originated from this need to organize our cities and the places that we live in a way where we can be healthy. So it's actually, the roots were actually in public health. And so as we develop public work systems to do all of the things that are needed to have a community or neighborhood thrive in an urban environment, things like energy were necessary. The way we locate our water systems, how we manage our waste, transportation, housing, where we put them in the city, all of these things are critical to public health. And so where we live is really guided by policies to ensure a safe, healthy, and productive social environment takes place. And so we have this system of multi-scaled governments, very local, regional, state, federal, and we develop these rules, regulations, and everything to manage how our little places grow and how they can thrive. And so these rules also include the multiple ways of creating the revenues we need to support all of this growth. And so a good way to look at energy policy and public policy in general is that it creates the soft and hard infrastructure needed to distribute the resources that make our neighborhoods thrive. And energy is an absolutely vital part of this planning process, because it really facilitates the access to what we call the social determinants of health. And these are the things that are essential for our well-being and succeeding in a market economy. Okay, so some questions here. We've got this big discussion, energy justice, environmental justice, any kind of justice we can think about. And it really has a lot to do with what we call racial justice. And the problem is that if we live in a colorblind society, why are we talking about injustice? These types of racial injustice. Even more important is, like, if we live in a market economy that's presumably colorblind and continues to have these racialized outcomes, how can we move forward in a market economy where we can measure everything by race and place? How do we call that equitable? So, just a quick Google on what is energy justice, right? It's the Initiative for Energy Justice tells us that it refers to the goals of achieving equity, okay? Social and economic participation in the energy system, remediating social, economic, and health burdens, and bringing those concerns up front from those people that have been historically disenfranchised by these racial and social and economic inequities. And the key point here is that it says, to make energy accessible and democratically managed. I mean, that is key. How do we democratically manage something like energy? And I got more questions. So knowing the existence of this inequity, the need for what we call energy equity, how can we identify the infrastructure that is used to create multiple forms of injustice over generations of time? Injustice doesn't happen by itself. Poverty just doesn't happen by itself. Can we identify the structure of inequality? And so energy justice, the concept of energy justice, attempts to provide that intervention point to correct historical processes of injustice. But the real question is, how can I really do that? And the bottom line is, how can we create the multiple forms of infrastructure needed to reach these concepts of equity and environmental justice? How do we actually make these concepts operational on the street, in the hood? That's what I want to talk about today. So let's start with a few clues for how we intervene. The first one is to understand our current market orientation of energy. Energy is not something we just give away, it's an exchange on the marketplace. And also, we need to acknowledge this historical process of inequality. And so that history is an important baseline or starting point for really understanding what energy justice is about. So this connection between presumably free and colorblind markets and the production of inequality really helps us to start teasing out these issues of energy and environmental justice in specific episodes on how it happens. And also, when we recognize the role of social determinants in market participation, social determinants of health provide us education, housing, infrastructure in our neighborhoods, where we go to school, where we go to work. All these things are part of those social determinants. And energy is a huge part of what we call a social determinant. It is an action variable, cause and effect, that influences an outcome. And another clue here is Senate Bill 1000 that requires local governments to add this thing they call an environmental justice component to the general plan updates. So each municipality has to have a general plan update that guides development and growth and for the future in their municipalities. And one of the things that Senate Bill 1000 does is it has a focus on what they call disadvantaged communities. Those places that have been left behind by the marketplace, that are left behind by public policy, left behind by divestment. And the focus is on those neighborhoods, those places, and how to end inequality. And so now energy and environmental justice have a spatial orientation. And for me, as an urban sociologist, that's important. And it gives us a clue where to start. And so using a social spatial approach, we know that spatial patterns reflect the way our society is organized. And governments, we give governments the responsibility of determining how that social organization unfolds. And so stages of urban development are really related to changes in the way governments distribute public resources to support places where we live. And so we want to analyze the development of space and the events that happen in that space by looking at capital. Investment determines who gets what. Public investment determines who gets what. So public investment is really key to understanding how infrastructure is distributed. And public investment means your tax dollars that you pay to municipalities, local governments, to federal governments, state governments. So when we look at it from that terms, these social determinants that guide human settlement really are spatially situated this gives this concept that everybody talks about, sustainability. It gives sustainability an important spatial characteristic that we need to recognize. Now, space, when we look at space, it also places the emphasis on the structure of inequality, not the deficient individual. And this is important as we're looking at this, especially for something like energy, where we're just talking about, customer rates and things of that sort. So this distribution of social determinants with a spatial characteristic really reflects government rule making. And energy here is no exception to this social spatial approach. So in any research, and for any good researcher that knows what he's doing, the first thing we need is a unit of analysis, or we cannot move forward. And for me, the neighborhood is a very important unit of analysis because it provides the context for understanding how we live, how we understand health, how we understand being successful at what we do. How to live a productive life. We live it in a neighborhood. And neighborhoods really represent these specific boundaries where social, it's an ecosystem where all of these things take place that allows us to live as people. This is different from community, and I want to make this very clear now. Community is this fuzzy concept that insinuates inclusion and fairness for all, right? The community of internet users, the community of people of color. Very fuzzy terms. Problem is, we can't create metrics for those terms. But when we talk about neighborhoods, we can create specific boundaries with which to measure differences. We can also measure how much investment goes into a place. And so now we're really giving some definition to this unit of analysis. Instead of saying community people, we're saying places where infrastructure is an investment. And so that physical location is very important when we start moving forward and understanding concepts like energy justice. And so we also need to understand what markets are about. Markets are basically a system of exchange, but there's no such thing as a free market. Markets have rules and conditions for them to function. And so we're going to go through these. And so the idea here is for you to understand how all these preconditions for a market to function equitably are violated every step of the way. And the first thing is property. If you don't have ownership to property, you have no value in that property. People can just take it from you with no repercussions, right? So property is important to create value in a product. Second, we need buyers and sellers. We have to have the right to participate in exchange. And when we don't have that right, it places limits on participation. It dictates our market position, and it skews the outcomes of markets and how they perform. And the next thing is information, because information determines price, quality, and quantity. It gives us an understanding of the value of the investment we want to make. It lets us create value, calculate value. It also gives us an indication of risk. It also tells us where we want to locate our investment. It gives us a customer profile, like a credit score, right? And it's also problematic when we see things like asymmetric information. Is everybody getting the same information? Hence the term, the market for lemons. George Akerlof's article in the 1970s about buying a used car. What if you don't have the Carfax when you go to the car dealer? Are you sure you're getting a fair deal? Are you buying a lemon? Information is key to this. And it's key to how we create this notion of a customer. Finally, money or credit, accessing capital, is access to the market. Public investment and where we put our public investment is also key to giving folks access to the market. So the question is who really gets access to the market? Where does market exchange really happen? And for whom? So understanding this, now we're actually able to start talking about this history of equity and how to apply it. Now, one more thing here is that when we're talking about equity, when we talk about things like income, it is closely linked and tied at the hip to race. So let me condense 1/4 of or a semester of knowledge into one slide here for you. So race is really not biological. It's really a social construction, what we sociologists call, something we made up. They're categories we create to designate differences between people. That difference is used to create multiple forms of distance: social, cultural, economic, legal, spatial. So race is really about a process, not a color, but a process used to create and measure distance between groups. That is what we want to talk about. That process used to create and measure distance, because it has an intergenerational effect on our well-being. So, more questions. How does a colorblind free market society continue to have racialized outcomes? And when we view this concept of race as a market process, it really helps us to articulate that structure, that institutional structure of energy and environmental injustice. Because in order to understand environmental justice and energy justice, we need to understand the injustice. So we need to look at race and poverty as a product of public policy. Nobody chooses to be a part of a specific race. Nobody chooses to be poor. We are assigned this. Okay, so let's look at housing, because housing is just really the perfect example for how markets perform and how we intervene on markets. So during the Great Depression of the early 30s, this is when the government actually starts intervening in the housing industry. We create a brand new housing financial structure called the 30-year mortgage. And it alters the urban planning landscape, because now we're building homes that are cheaper than rent, because people can buy homes with government-assisted financing. The problem there, as we start booming out of this Great Reset and the Depression, access to credit was contingent upon what we call race covenants, or deed restrictions on properties, placing racial constraints on who can own property and who can access the capital, the federally sponsored mortgages, to buy homes. So race and value was now connected to risk, creating racial bias as a business necessity. And this is why on the right side of the screen, what you'll see in homes built before 1950 in any major city in the US, you will see these things called the race covenant in your covenants, deeds, restrictions, where they have a list of all the restrictions things you can't do on your property. And this is one of them that was put right into homes then. It says, no persons of any race other than a Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race. So now you can see this phrase alone that legally goes into a real estate transaction compromises all the market preconditions. Who can own, who can sell, who can access capital. But more importantly, it compromises that precondition called information. What kind of market signals does this send out? And here's where we start seeing that modernization of what we call bias, because it's built into our economic system and it becomes an economic necessity rather than a racial act. And this is huge, because when we start developing our cities, we see that the places that were not given access to capital, that were not given access to government loans, these places become targets for redevelopment because nobody can leverage their property to improve it. They can't sell it because they're racially integrated places. And so federally sponsored loans did not allow FHA financing in racially integrated neighborhoods. And if you can't run capital through your neighborhoods implode, and they become targets for federally sponsored redevelopment programs like you see in Sacramento here, up on the upper right side. So as we come in and redevelop all of this, what we call blighted space because of government-sponsored redlining, you have massive displacement. At the same time, we start building freeways. We start building our new transportation systems. And now you can see that on the left side, it's a freeway under construction in the mid-50s. This is a WX freeway when you're entering Sacramento from Davis. And you could see that this stretch of land was home to the largest African-American population in Sacramento at the time. So this is where we plant the freeway. So now you see this displacement come in multiple ways, not only from redevelopment, but from freeway construction. And so we have to move these people somewhere. But we have all these race covenants in town, and they can only move to certain places. So we move them to Sacramento's most beautiful interracial subdivision. So how is that for market manipulation? And when we do these things, we manipulate all the public infrastructure investment to match these patterns of racial distancing. So now you see people that were held captive downtown because of racial restrictions. And when that creates an opportunity for wealth accumulation, we displace these people and move them to places that do not have any infrastructure investment. So now you can see that the ghetto is mobile. We can move it wherever we need to, contingent upon local government's needs. So here is, a year's worth of classwork in race relations in one screen here. On the right, on the left, we see the initial redlining map from FHA in the 1930s. And this is Sacramento. And you see up in the upper left-hand side, it's downtown Sacramento. And you see these places are redlined because this is where all of the minorities were living in Sacramento. And that's actually where my parents met. So you see that they were bounded by these by mortgage redlining. And then race covenants prohibited them from moving other places. And as we move down the line with redevelopment that pushes them, that forces them out, now we see them move on the right side to places that do not have race covenants, which are north and south. So we have this process of gentrification, displacement, another round of redlining that goes north and south, realtor gatekeeping and sprawl that matches the use of race covenants. So left to right, we have race covenants, affluence, resources. North to south, we have high concentrations of minority populations, high concentrations of poverty, no resources, no jobs. And that's our baseline geography for understanding how markets work. And if we look at that geography, we can basically measure any social ill in the city. If we want to look at where Black and brown people live, it's north and it's south. If we want to look at poverty, it's north, it's south. We want to look at education. We want to look at employment. It's east and west. We want to look where all of our subprime loans go. We know that subprime lending increased as the number of non-whites increased in the census tract. We know where they are, north and south. Matter of fact, I did this for every census tract in the United States, and this same thing held true. If we want to look where our infrastructure investment goes, over on the left side, let's take a look at where our regional dollars go from the Sacramento, SACOG, for you folks, if you folks are familiar with SACOG, area Council of Governments. And basically, they're a pass-through for federal and state funds and that go to municipalities for transportation planning, for transportation projects, freeways, etc. So let's look at where the dollars go. A small dot is projects from 10 million to 50 million. The big dots are projects for 50 million to over 100 million. And so if you know anything about these infrastructure projects, I'm giving you here data from 2012. And the reason I'm doing that is because this process of regional investment takes years to really roll out. You start with design grants that then turn into engineering grants and then turn into actual construction grants. So that process from design to construction can actually take 10 years. And so those projects that were funded in 2012 are now just starting to be completed, so that you can see the effects of where those infrastructure dollars go. And we can see that they don't go anywhere near red line space. So we can see where our public investment goes. And public investment is key to markets functioning. It's part of that infrastructure. It facilitates commerce. It facilitates everything that we do. So we can see that none of these investment dollars go into that red line space. Now, redlining takes a different type of meaning. The discussion goes beyond the mortgage. Now it goes beyond how we use our public investments and for whom. And if we look over to the right side, this is out of the UC Davis Health Community Health Needs Assessment, where they're supposed to identify underserved places, communities of concern, they call them. But if we look at where they're planning all of their primary care and specialty care facilities, it's nowhere near the people that need it the most. Because of the way we do health finance, there's a different level of reimbursement for Medi-Cal than there is for people who have jobs and good jobs and can afford health insurance from their employer. So when we're looking at things like employment that we know where it's physically located, we can see how employment really is your gateway to health insurance. And if we look at education, where the educational outcomes are, we can see how education has an impact on employment, so that you can see how all these social determinants kind of link together and create this intergenerational pattern. If we look at our trees in Sacramento, they're going in all of the places that have the race covenants. If we look at Cal Viral Screen from the state EPA folks, Cal Viral Screen is a bundle of metrics that help us tease out the relationships between poverty, race, and environmental hazards. There's about 60 different indicators. You could see where all of those indicators are. They're north and they're south. So you can see how these patterns of racial exclusion unfold over time. And so this was what we call social closure. because it preserves privilege through restriction. And because racial exclusion requires this concept of subordination and market indicator, it disseminates this type of information that really makes us think about everything that we do, where we put our public investment, who do we allow in our churches and our schools, how do we create special programs to exclude people and to include people, like in our schools, we're tracking students differently. Get some water here. So unfortunately, public policy has taken the role of a strategy for compromising market preconditions, market exclusion, and market monopolization. And closure as a social process, this is driven by public policy. And this is what we need to be aware of. Now, even more so, even more important, is the effects of the social closure, because it has a monotonic function that when things are going good, man, it just snowballs and things go great in the neighborhood. But when you start taking apart the pieces, it creates this tailspin that goes down, and these neighborhoods fail to recover. And so that understanding this monotonic functionality is key to understanding the plight of neighborhoods and how this inequity really works. Okay, so enough of that. So let's start talking about how do we start fixing this stuff. And so we really need to design for solutions. We need to design, first of all, by considering the context of the conditions that certain places that are left behind in. There's a reason when we're saying energy justice and environmental justice, there's a reason why we're saying those things, because conditions in certain places are just so blatantly obtuse that people are speaking up. So our current context is this racial spatial inequality in multiple forms. And we have this public health problem because in some neighborhoods, you've got environmental stuff going on, you've got COVID stuff going on at a disproportionate rate, you've got public safety issues going on, and you have this environmental stewardship issue. Some places are well taken care of, some are not. Some places we use as dumping grounds, some places we build our cogeneration energy plants, some places we build our freeways. And so how do we start looking at this context when we start designing solutions? So first, one of the things that I've found in trying to revitalize neighborhoods is that public policy is actually an asset that is usually not looked at. I mean, there's these public rules are really assets that you're not going to see in neighborhoods. They're external to the neighborhoods. So if we look first at SB 535 and AB 1550, which basically designates these disadvantaged communities, we know location is now an important quality for climate change funding to hit. So as if you're a neighborhood, if you understand this, now you understand what you should be doing to attract this capital to your neighborhood. And so now we can see planning is changing. How do we include environmental justice in the general plan updates? So there's specific directions on what to do. And we're supposed to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we're supposed to do sustainable community strategies and local climate action plans. Now the question is, how do we measure all this stuff? And how do we mesh it together to develop planning at the neighborhood scale, which is my unit of analysis? So first, we need to know what this thing called sustainability is about. It's about this balance between the environment, economy, and equity. One can't be more than the other. You're supposed to have a balance, right? And when we do this, sustainability allows us to enable current generations to meet social, economic, and environmental needs to have, a successful life, places of well-being. And we should be able to do that without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And so that requires, us to protect and preserve the environment that we live in, urban and rural. And when we do this right, it really encourages economic productivity, because public resources are distributed equally. Everybody gets the same toolkit. And when we do this properly, projects become restorative and regenerative by design. And this is key. Projects must be restorative and regenerative by design. And it allows us to do that type of resilience planning that everybody talks about, but nobody knows what it means. In essence, sustainability brings us a circular economic activity in our neighborhoods. Our neighborhoods create, they work, and they live all in the same place. It's the thing about the coffee beans, right? Grow the beans, I grind them up, I turn them into coffee, I sell the coffee, I take the grinds, I put them back in the ground and grow some more, and I take those revenues and do other things in the neighborhood, right? In the neighborhood. So you have people in the neighborhood working for people in the neighborhood that they live in. Circular economic action. So with that in mind, we need to see how our public investment transactions must be restorative and regenerative by design and in practice. So when we build a freeway somewhere, when we build a power plant somewhere, we're building roads, we're building schools, we need to look for the environment, for that social infrastructure. How does those projects, or any proposed project in our neighborhood, also nurture that social infrastructure, that physical infrastructure? Does it preserve and enhance a natural capital? And does it create that circular economic activity? Are those public investment transactions equitable? Do they result in an equitable redistribution? Does it provide market access? Does it provide social protections? And so when we're evaluating green investment and any kind of development coming into your neighborhood, these transactions must be restorative and regenerative by design, but they also have to have these reciprocal links. So all these things need to connect. And this is a very messy diagram here, but you get the idea on how social protections actually has to enhance our physical environment, our social infrastructure. How does market access really allow us to preserve and enhance natural capital? So you can see how all these things mesh, they're interdependent. And so when we're linking these neighborhoods to climate change, how do we evaluate projects that come down into our neighborhoods? How does a poor neighborhood like Oak Park, South Oak Park, for example, evaluate Aggie Square that's dropped right in their neighborhood? Does that create, this imbalance between environment, economy, and equity? So what we're doing now is creating some filters to build some metrics. We have a host of environmental analytics. We can measure the particulate matter in the sky. We can measure all kinds of things, right? So you use those and you see where they're physically situated. And we have these social analytics. We got all kinds of demographic data and all of this stuff. And you combine that with analytical filters, reliability, restoration, regeneration, resilience, and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, because of course we're equity minded. And here's where we create the measurements. So this is what's normally referred to as the social determinants. This is what we need in our neighborhood, not just as individuals, but as a neighborhood that seeks to build community. We need education, we need employment, we need healthcare, we need wealth accumulation, we need housing. And all of these are connected at the hip. If education goes bad, employment goes bad, Wealth goes bad, health goes bad because your health insurance is tied to your job. Housing goes bad because you have no income, so your schools are going to be crappy. So now your education suffers, and you can see how all this interdependency works. And the infrastructure, those blue lines that hold all of this together, this hard and soft infrastructure, includes energy, economic development, environmental planning, the political and legal system, technology. So you can see how all of these are linked together. And it's multi-scale. It happens at the neighborhood scale. It happens at the municipal scale, regional scale. It happens at the state scale, so that you can see how all these things take place. At the micro level, at the neighborhood level, this is where all the things physically happen. At the meso level, it's an implementation of policies that happen at the macro level. So that you can see that looking at one small unit of analysis like the neighborhood is not that simple. And this is where we need to apply all these metrics too. So when I talk about reliability and say we're looking at something like transportation, can I depend on it? Will it take me where I'm going to go? Will it get me there on time? If not, what's wrong with it? Can I afford to ride this bus? Can I afford to pay that energy bill? Will it cause me harm? Will it cause others harm? So now we can start figuring out how to create metrics from these tools. And if I can't rely on it, how do I fix it? What exactly do I need to fix? What can I fix? And does it support the environment that I live in? When I look at regeneration, can it support productivity and growth without harm? Can it provide support for future needs of the people that live where I live? Does it create a circular economic productivity for my neighborhood? Not for the world, not for the government, not for the utility company, but for my neighborhood, my unit of analysis. Resilience. Can I prevent something from happening? Can I recover from it? How do we recover? What kind of planning do we need to incorporate climate change? Sorry for that misspelling. Into planning for disadvantaged, what is known as disadvantaged communities. And Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says everybody's supposed to get a fair share at public resources. And so are resources distributed equally? Does planning reflect the needs of the neighborhood? Are we preventing or correcting, or both, disparate impact, where one population is impacted adversely more than another? So that gives you an idea how to start looking at projects that are proposed for places. And so when we're looking at neighborhoods, what do we really need to start moving that snowball down the cliff so that things begin to happen? Well, first, we need an energy policy that allows neighborhoods to participate in energy markets as producers, not as welfare dependents on utility subsidies. We need transit policy that brings transit to the housing we live in, rather than housing to the transit. We need housing policies that financially support neighborhoods' specific needs and income. Housing in neighborhoods requires a bundle, an array of housing products that take you from homelessness to home ownership. And we need the financial infrastructure that allows that to happen. And we need distributed healthcare and education delivery that brings access to those most in need rather than support displacement. These hospital systems are huge. They're developers. Okay, so some ideas here from my work in South Sacramento. Complete streets really start changing things around here. They become the foundation for multimodal transit. They take care of things like heat mitigation. They take care of stormwater issues. Brings you that green canopy that we see in other neighborhoods with race covenants. It creates that public space so that we start building that sense of community. You know, the health and safety issues. It increases businesses because the business resident connectivity, because now you're walking on the street. You can't walk these streets before. And no sidewalks. And now we're enhancing the conditions for investment. Taking care of economy, equity, ecology, right? This is what we're looking at in planning. And when we do that, we have our complete streets going on to the right. To the left, we look at businesses and we bring this green canopy in. And we look at all of our lots that are vacant over years. And we can bring things like housing. And what we do is we can link it together so that you have business, housing, along with your transit. I mean, this is really what you want, transit-oriented development. But we don't call it that in poor neighborhoods. So this really refocuses how we look at neighborhoods. You know, we extend that green canopy, we make that connectivity between appropriate housing, not affordable housing, because we don't want apartment complexes. We want home ownership. Access to neighborhood transit systems, neighborhood-focused transit systems, where we can walk, we can bike, take the shuttles and things of that sort to places of commerce inside our corridors, inside our neighborhoods, our business corridors. And so things like neighborhood-focused transit, small-scale transit that moves inside of our neighborhoods, that connects us to things like light rails and bus lines, which we don't have in these places. So now, instead of moving housing to the transit, we have this intermediary here that connects and revitalizes our commercial core, because people from downtown can take light rail to the light rail station, take our little shuttle to our business district, go buy their doppels and head right back out of town to go back to work for lunchtime. You know, we create conditions for local investment, and we do the reduced vehicle miles traveled thing that everybody's worried about, right? So now you see all this connectivity happen. And while this is happening, you can also do things like solar canopy projects in over rooftops and over parking lots. And so this provides a renewable energy source. We can start testing things like storage. We can start developing things like microgrid and islanding from the grid in times of disasters. So now you contributes to your disaster recovery planning for your neighborhood. Takes care of your heat mitigation with all your parking lots and things of that sort. And when you can sell this energy back to people in the neighborhood, it reduces utility costs for tenants like businesses. Because if you understand the concept of the duck curve and where that energy is used the most, this is where that energy cost relief is needed at that time. And if you're going down places like South Sacramento, on this neighborhood in particular, Franklin, there's nothing but Mexican restaurant, Mexican businesses that are open at 5 o'clock for the hottest part of the day, right? And now they're paying the highest rate possible to be open. And so when you're developing local energy products, this can alleviate the cost that these folks are paying for energy, the high rates of energy that they're paying. And because they're held captive to one system of delivery, those costs keep escalating. And it puts people out of business, and then it puts people out of work. And so when we start reducing these costs, you know, we can actually do things like energy asset management training on how to manage all these types of things. That creates workforce patterns, so work development patterns, should I say pathways. And then we look at public health, you know, because in these places, a lot of people don't have air conditioning. We can have cooling centers. And we can now go green with our transportation. We can create charging stations that produce revenues for the neighborhood instead of the utility company. And we can also create revenues from the sale of energy to tenants, like in a small shopping strip there. So it becomes a neighborhood research site when we do things like this. And if we take bigger projects like fields that have just been not used for decades, since I was a kid, and I'm 65 years old, and these vacant fields still exist in these neighborhoods. So we can repurpose them and put large-scale solar farms up. And so you can see on this project right here that we proposed a 4 megawatt energy farm, solar farm here. And right in the middle of that dark blue space, that's a canopy where you can actually have public meetings under, public events and things of that sort. And then you mix it with your soccer fields and football fields. And this is behind a church, which means it's a center for people gathering. So now your neighborhood turns into a sense of community, and it generates revenues. And when we generate revenues, we can apply these revenues to specific needs in the neighborhood that have been neglected. This is that circular economic activity that we're discussing here. And not only can it produce revenue, it actually contributes to the climate change goals. And we can replicate this model. And here's a rough idea of what it looks like. You have banks, investors, you do long-term solar impact financing so that you can afford to do this kind of stuff and not be dependent upon grants. We can actually tap into cap and trade dollars. You could add, so at the neighborhood scale, you're doing things like the installation, the operation, the maintenance, the ownership, the production, that local energy production from non-governmental organizations or nonprofits. They produce solar, and in turn, they could move it to a utility company or a community choice aggregator, which all municipalities should be doing, but haven't got a clue yet on how to get started. This in turn creates pathways for work, and neighborhoods actually can get reduced, reduced energy bills. So everybody kind of wins on this kind of stuff. And when you start to incorporate, electric vehicles into this infrastructure, then the neighborhood becomes the fueling station, the future fueling station, rather than allowing the utility company to extract all of these revenues from the neighborhood can actually start generating its own revenues. So what does this look like? The first step is really comprehensive energy planning, where neighborhoods are actually involved in production, in management, and revenue generation. That energy can could be produced locally with the land that's available in multiple ways. We need storage, and we need distribution. That really lowers the future cost of energy in our most vulnerable places. It actually facilitates that move from fossil fuel transit to green transit. It also changes how our housing is built. When we build housing with energy in mind, this really changes the game for not only households, but for neighborhoods engaged in this. And so when we start looking at things like microgrid development at the neighborhood scale, this really changes the game on how you revitalize a neighborhood. And the most important thing here is that we need dedicated financial instruments that can help finance these things at low or no cost like interest, in the form of like social impact bonds that can be securitized and sold on Wall Street. And this takes the dependency away from state and local grants and ownership. And when you do that, you can actually afford to do things like neighborhood-focused health, to decentralize that healthcare planning so that it can be happening at the neighborhood scale, creating preceptor programs at universities, on-the-job training that happens in the neighborhood, and create a virtual health program where people can dial up and call right into folks that are trained to provide immediate health care to people. We could do allied health, where people go into homes and do things like preventive care, or the kind of care that happens after somebody comes out of a hospital. And when you're doing it just at the neighborhood scale, that really helps alleviate the problem of people having to go back into the hospital for care, because hospitals are expensive. And so what we're doing is creating this public health continuum of care, that really focuses on prevention. And what that does is create ladders of opportunity to jobs in the healthcare sector. The thing is that renewable energy actually can support this healthcare infrastructure. So here's what it looks like. Here's a taste of the planning that needs to happen. At the local level, at the neighborhood level, you need to plan for renewable energy production and energy efficiency in our buildings and our houses. We need clean transit options that help us move around within our neighborhood. Public transit today takes you from one part of town to the other, but most of our trips are usually within our neighborhoods, and that's where the transit really needs to be. We need healthcare access that's not contingent upon how much money we make. And we need these cradle to career pathways in housing and energy and healthcare. And when we do this right, we create the housing and infrastructure investment that has to take place for home ownership to happen. We can no longer depend on governments to give us grants for down payment assistance and things of that sort. And as a realtor, with 40 years experience in the real estate industry, I'll tell you, those programs do not work. And when we start creating building and improvement maintenance programs, now we're putting people to work. And it's all revolving around energy. So when we do that, we hit those elements of sustainability. We hit that balance between economic action, environmental stewardship, and fairness. And so there's a logic to this. I mean, this stuff really works here. We're talking about investing in neighborhoods. Training happens, technical assistance happens, education happens. People become aware in multiple ways. Businesses become aware, households become aware. And when we mesh that with appropriate financing infrastructures that give us the capacity to start building things, such as solar farms, we see direct effects. We see revenues produced for the neighborhood. We see lower energy costs. We see an increased disposable household income, which means people are going to be shopping. We see reduced business expense, because in the survey I did in one neighborhood in South Sacramento, one of their biggest business concerns was the cost of energy. And this actually provides access to services, because we're bringing all of these things down here, like healthcare, neighborhood healthcare planning. Is like, wow, that's bizarre. And so now it results in locally produced jobs. This is the circular economic activity that we're looking for. And the indirect effect is that increased local spending happens, which means increased business revenues, energy production becomes efficient, energy consumption becomes at a price that people can afford. We got healthy people, healthy places, and a healthy business core. Neighborhood starts to thrive. We reach that target of neighborhood sustainability. Businesses become stabilized, and we don't have to depend on marijuana dispensaries to hold up the neighborhood. We avoid displacement, because people get to stay in their homes because they get to keep their jobs and they're working in the places they live. All of this moves a neighborhood from a physical space to a community, a social space. That's what we're really trying to do. And creating that circular economic activity, which energy allows us to do, means that neighborhood, that crazy neighborhood of all those poor people and all that crime, actually becomes an active participant in climate change. Okay, So the key here is we really need to refocus the intent. As researchers, we really need to know what problem are we really trying to solve and for whom. So it's important that we have that research question down. What are we doing in the places that we want to revitalize? Because this becomes the basis for developing needs assessment tools. And how do we go in and assess the conditions of a neighborhood? And when we understand that research question, that becomes the basis for the data we collect. And in turn, those can be turned into neighborhood housing plans that outline the specific bundle of housing products and the financing that needs to get those, take us all in a neighborhood from homelessness to home ownership. And we need a neighborhood energy plan to understand how to bring that circular economic activity to the places that we live. And we need a neighborhood-specific infrastructure plan. How does all of this public infrastructure work at the neighborhood scale? All of this together, all these projects and planning, they have to produce pathways for education, employment, and energy production, and public health. And this is the foundation for establishing community benefits agreements with developers, like universities, who extend their campuses in the poorest neighborhoods in our city. So we have some problems here. Neighborhoods just can't do this alone, because when it comes to grant making and where all this funding goes, they're not a qualified applicant. We need sponsors. We need municipalities who are, at the place, they are the qualified applicants. And so are they bringing these revenues down to the places that are most in need? What are the political gatekeeping issues that happen that neutralize this neighborhood development? We have council of governments, transportation authorities, joint powers, other governing boards, and you'll see all of our elected officials, they're sitting on all of these. So there's, a lot of times there's a conflict of interest that prevent these, that raises another set of barriers. And it leaves, neighborhoods with no capacity. Neighborhoods and people that live in them, we pay taxes. And for those taxes, we get a bundle of goods from our municipalities. But now it seems like we have to be fighting for that bundle of goods because they're not distributed equally. And we have to show how they're not distributed equally. And we have to show what we really need to revitalize our neighborhoods. The problem is neighborhoods do not have the capacity to do that. They can't do the research. They don't do design and engineering. And without this access to technical skills, neighborhoods can't really assess projects that are happening. They can't promote projects that are happening. And we're really reduced to what we call community engagement. And that's how agencies meet their Title VI requirements. And when funding for projects is really targeted for shovel-ready projects, how do you do that without any plans? So planning for neighborhoods happens externally. And so when we start looking at this micro level of analysis, we start understanding what colorblind policy really is. Another important thing that happened is, I think it was about 2011 or 2014, I think, when Governor Brown was in office, he shut down redevelopment agencies across the state. And so what happened is that agencies that were supposed to be at the forefront of this process are no longer in existence or reduced to things like public housing. And so that reduced neighborhood representation to pretty much a single individual. So your elected council member, or board member, or whatever it is in your neighborhood, He's the gatekeeper and the entry point for the environmental justice process to actually begin, which is a pretty scary thought. Okay. So we lose all this planning at the neighborhood scale, and planning remains a top-down process where the city plans are assuming to meet the neighborhood needs. And so that's how this community engagement process that agencies must do, this becomes a proxy for neighborhood planning and Title VI compliance, which is dangerous. So one of the things that I want to caution you about, these illusionary actions that we see, is please do not conflate agency-sponsored community engagement with neighborhood-specific planning. Regional plans do not solve neighborhood plans. Energy planning by utilities to manage and control production is really not neighborhood energy planning. Community solar is a perfect example of that illusionary inclusion process. Community solar basically creates a dependency and avenues for capital extraction from our poorest neighborhoods. Overcoming energy injustice is a process that requires neighborhood-specific energy planning that identifies our future needs, resilience planning, and identifying the impediments to the resources we need to create that circular economic activity in our neighborhoods. So energy planning is really vital. It's like super important to understanding neighborhood sustainability. Regional planning is not designed for that. You cannot solve a neighborhood problem with a regional plan. So we really need to refocus what we call community engagement. And it needs to emphasize community-focused planning in a way that goes beyond the letter of the law. Just holding public meetings, although it meets the letter of the law, does not really meet the spirit of the law. And so we have to understand that we're trying to undo 100 years of racial antagonisms, 100 years, okay? This requires some super duper intensive planning, man. This is not gonna happen overnight. So we need this array of planning tools that from 5-year and 10-year. We need to identify those housing products needed to stabilize our poorest neighborhoods. We need to identify the infrastructure needed for that transformation for neighborhoods to really be participants in climate change. As producers of energy, not just dependent users. You've got to identify those short-term projects, that immediate need, and that long-term programs. Identifying those long-term programs that bring restoration, regeneration, and help stabilize our poorest neighborhoods. And when we do that, it creates long-term pathways for our social determinants, public health, energy, housing, education. And these development plans for our neighborhoods, are really protection plans. How does a neighborhood protect themselves? And when they understand how to use metrics like reliability, restoration, regeneration, resilience, Title VI, we will know how to evaluate large-scale development projects that enter our neighborhoods. So moving towards solutions, this concept of equity. Social impact is a most important goal of any kind of justice that we're talking about. Social justice, environmental justice, energy justice, you name it, restorative justice. Social impact is the goal. And our public infrastructure investment has to come with social protections that ensure that every neighborhood gets an equitable redistribution and a fair share of all the resources that they need to move forward to achieve that balance between restoration and growth. We need to fix things and grow in a safe way and a responsible way. And when we make our public investments, they have to produce opportunity pathways for our poorest neighborhoods. And if disparities exist, that public investment better promote these restorative practices, or it should not be allowed to take place. And measurement is key to accountability. If we can't measure anything, then we can't hold people accountable. And this is why we use the neighborhood as the most important unit of analysis, because it is the basis for measurement. A quick word on utility companies. Energy infrastructure is now designed for large-scale energy production and distribution that's privately owned. Our public policies now make privately owned utility companies too big to fail, like the banks that are too big to fail, and we always have to bail them out and support them. Well, this is what we're doing now, and it creates a dependency because utility companies are allowed to control the marketplace. So the structure of large-scale energy markets really prevents this transformation of neighborhoods moving from consumers to producers of energy. And that really stunts the economic growth of these neighborhoods. We want all of our neighborhoods to thrive, but yet we cut off the important tools that are needed for them to transform. And now public infrastructure investment supports the entry of utility companies into the transportation fuel market. SMUD and PG&E are now going to be my gas station, right? And as our public infrastructure investment supports this move to EV and provides money for creating the infrastructure to move to EV, the question is, who owns that energy? Does the neighborhood own that energy? Or does the utility company own that energy? So now you can see how we continue to compromise all of these market preconditions. So policies that expand access to solar and storage, these really can help, reduce pollution, build resilience to climate change, and these are the things that where we're headed, but these are not in the plans, the long-term plans for utility companies. The scary thing here is because of the market control that utilities companies have, the only way we can do climate change is through the permission of utility companies, which neutralizes everybody else. So what's the difference between equity and Title VI? Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, it says everything is supposed to be distributed fairly. One of our problems is that we can't conflate advocacy with planning. This is like going into the doctor and say, I hope you get well, and that's your operation. No, we need analytics. Okay. And this thing about ceremonial adequacy, bringing everybody together, casting your net out there and saying, hey, we're engaged. Let's empower people. Let's go to the colored neighborhoods and empower them, right? Other than the fact that it's just totally, insulting, it doesn't give you any real data. So we create real, metrics with engagement. And that doesn't do anything for our ability to plan. The missing metric really is where the hell is the money going? And so concepts like regional equity and things of this sort, they're meaningless terms because there's no enforcement on regional equity. Equity really comes down to our elected officials and the agendas that they have as they move through their time in office. So if we're not careful, equity really becomes this illusion of a meaningful civil rights dialogue. So this discussion about equity and building healthy communities, right? It's really a discussion about public infrastructure investment as a social and economic determinant. Is that public investment really doing what it's supposed to do and for whom? Public infrastructure investment really reflects, our priorities. And right now we can see that investment is really conditioned on return on investment, not equity. And so we really need to look at the interventions that create inequitable distribution of wealth. And we need to really recognize how public protections are unequally applied. And so this discussion about equity really needs to include this discussion on circular and restorative economic action and how that takes place at the neighborhood scale. Okay, I've talked your ears off enough. And I want to leave you with these last few tidbits of info. One of the things that we have to understand is that a very comprehensive, intricate public, private, and political infrastructure was used to create a century of harm. And now, planning for our neighborhoods to revitalize it, to recover from this harm, our planning must be for solutions that are equal to or greater than that harm, a cumulative harm. And we really need to understand the need for a dedicated financial infrastructure that's specifically designed for revitalizing neighborhoods. And that has to be in place. And that's not rocket science, because we've done this before. It was called FHA finance. It was called tax increment finance. The problem is it excluded racial groups, minorities from that process. And so we can use these tools again, these financial tools again, we can use these tools with simple modifications that promotes a logic of reinvestment in our neighborhoods without predation. And when we do that, we can make sure that the precision of our solutions really matches the precision of harm, of that harm that was caused, because we know how precise that harm was. Here's where you can find me. And if you need more info on this type of work, you could Google City of Sacramento Environmental Justice. And on that page, there's a link to this report called Race and Place in Sacramento. And I cover all of this stuff that gives you more detail so that you can dig in a bit more. Okay, let's open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. That was great. We actually have a question in the chat from a bit earlier. I can read from Val, and Val, feel free to unmute as well if you'd like to. They say state got rid of CRA some time ago that could help drive investment in DAC communities. Anything afoot to bring that back to address economic, energy equity, etc.?
Could I have some clarification on CRA? Community Investment Act. What's the Val? Any help out there?
Yeah, I think you covered this in your later slides where you talked about Governor Jerry Brown getting rid of the CRA in 09 or 2011, something like that. Is there anything afoot to bring some of those benefits back?
We've started changing how we use the concept of tax increment financing. We're now calling them enhanced infrastructure financing districts, but it's pretty much the same thing, where we give local governments the ability to issue bonds for the type of development that they want to do. You can look in Sacramento, you can see Aggie Square is one such project. But other than that, I'm not seeing a whole lot.
Very good.
We had your last president who did opportunity zones, but that was more towards extraction than helping neighborhoods. Does that get this some sort of an answer? It's a very vague answer because there's really nothing there.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Or Jessica, you could read the questions that you want me to respond to.
Yeah, it looks like in the chat there's just a lot of compliments. Great presentation.
Well, that's a good sign.
Echo those compliments. And I can echo Meg's statement that it was very impactful to see how explicit a lot of the racist language was. But yeah, anyone who would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute and go for it, or just raise your hand. And in the meantime, maybe I can ask one question. You said that race and place report that you put out there was delivered to the city of Sacramento, and I was just wondering, what their reaction was to that, and what steps maybe they're taking, or you are taking, I guess, to kind of move that forward and move everything that you've kind of told us now forward.
So it was the city that actually contacted me to write this report. And they wanted to use that as a supplement to their general plan update, to give them sort of an analytical lens to work with. At the meantime, they're holding their community engagement and going through all of their community type planning to give them some info to use in their general plan update. So I'm really not quite sure how they're using it, but for me, they didn't give me much to work with. They said, we want something along, the color of law, Richard Rothstein's book about Sacramento. I said, well, I already done that 10 years ago. And they said, well, do it again and show us the effects and then give us best practices. The problem is they couldn't really define best practices. And so that I use this as an opportunity to develop a lot of the guidelines that you saw me present today, so that we can inform people in the neighborhoods that are actually engaged in this stuff, practitioners, of a different way to start thinking about this. Because they have no metrics, they have no guidelines. All they have is numbers. We can block a freeway, we can block entrance to the King's game, but once we do that, what do? We can take them to court and file injunctions and all this stuff to stop things. But once you get to that point, and you can't afford legal representation and things like depositions and discovery proceedings, what do you do if you're a neighborhood? And so I wrote that race and place report with those kind of barriers to neighborhood development in mind. And energy is like a huge part of that.
That's great. Thank you. Well, it looks like we hit our 3:30 mark, but I just want to say thank you so much for this presentation. No, this was great. It was great to hear a really complete background of the research you're doing, and just of Sacramento in general, and how that relates to the social determinants that you talked about, and social closure, and how to really work with communities and as you said, neighborhoods to further.
So if anybody wants to stick around and ask for questions, I'm more than happy to spend more time. I know people got to head out and move, but if we want to go beyond it, I'm open to that.
Dr. Hernandez, I just want to thank you very much. And since you're in Sacramento, you should hang out in the Capitol building a little more, so you can talk to legislators.
Oh no, I did that already.
Okay.
I did this presentation to one of the assembly committees, and they just didn't know what to do with it. And the problem is their unit of analysis is different. They're at a much larger scale. They're looking at the state, right? And I don't care about the state. I don't care about the city. I care about those neighborhoods. That's my unit of analysis. So that's what we're trying to make things work for. And that is the site of inequality. It's not inequality across the state. It's inequality where I live that really affects me.
Thank you very much.
I see a hand up somewhere.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I think in particular, it's really helpful to understand the background that led up to kind of the current geography and patterns and cities and systems looking the way that they are today. I think we definitely within energy kind of sometimes take things as a neutral starting point today. And I think understanding why they are that way is extremely helpful. My question, I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but something that I've been thinking about is just, I know you talked about kind of the limitations of state agencies in addressing local problems because they're on the regional scale. And I've also been thinking about the limitation of state agencies and government processes to address issues and kind of work with the community, partly just because of how the meetings are structured. And just because, you know, they have to comply with Bagley-Keene or the Brown Act or whatever kind of policies are making it so they have to have the agenda in advance, like this time for like limited time for public comment, and generally kind of a dry and one directional flow of information. So I'm kind of curious if you've seen good examples of that, either from like agencies who have done a planning process that incorporated everyone a little like more effectively, or if neighborhood meetings or other groups kind of have different ways of running meetings that you think is better.
You've touched on a hugely important problem. You know, one, if I want to inform my council member, I go to the meeting and I get 2 minutes. You know, it took me 2 minutes to say hello to you folks, okay? You know, so I could, you know, there's no way I could get anything across. But the thing is that what's missing from this engagement process is that we're missing a wonderful window of opportunity here. One is because local municipal planners are not trained to work at the neighborhood scale. They're simply not trained for that. They're not bad people. They just don't have the training for it. And that's not in the urban planning radar. The urban planning is to go big or go home, right? Let's change the world all at once. And I'm saying, no, because every neighborhood is different. Different people, different cultures, different realities, different environmental problems and things of that sort. And so our planning has to be neighborhood specific. And that's not a real efficient way to work because we don't have enough planners for the city to do all of that. And, you know, if we go off and get all of our PhDs and get moving, and, you know, we're not going to work for no wages. We have a career we need to get in place. So we're not going to go back to the hood and work for $35 a month or less, which is what I worked for. So you don't have the capacity to do that planning at that scale so that you can go to this community event and articulate what you need. So that's why this transformation for community engagement needs to happen, where it's more of a doctor-patient relationship, where your doctor goes to you and says, where does it hurt? Let's do some tests. Oh, we see that tumor. And the doctor is able to describe that tumor to you and the effects and the consequences. Neighborhoods do not get those diagnostics. If we know there's a creek full of pollution running into your backyard, we don't need a community engagement. We need EPA scientists over there to tell us the effects of these things, right? And so those processes needed to be built into that community engagement process, where experts are giving people sound advice on the conditions of where they live. What is the effects of, you know, going solar, rooftop solar in your neighborhoods? Does it put the utility company at a disadvantage because they lose revenues and they can't support that, you know, municipal-wide infrastructure that legacy infrastructure that's already outdated? How does a neighborhood understand this problem? Nobody is there to guide them through that process. So now the community engagement process needs to be more in line with educating us so that we can make real decisions. That's the part that's missing. How do we get to that process? What is the role of a university in that process? And I'll be square with you right now. Participant action research does not get me there. I need research scientists in these neighborhoods, understanding that the neighborhood is a valuable unit of analysis that is worthy of our attention, because that's where inequality takes place. So if we're looking at this nexus between energy and environment and race and inequities, that's where we need to start. We need to start at this research level with trained researchers who are able to understand real research methods in these places. So for me, being a researcher and going down to a neighborhood just changed everything, because then I was able to see the processes of how the money is passed out and what it took to get money into neighborhoods. So when we're talking about that Complete Streets project, in the poorest neighborhood in Sacramento, we want a Complete Streets project because we understood the grant process. And then I sat on the review teams for those grants. And so that I knew that if you develop a plan of action, so I developed a neighborhood economic development plan and accompanied that with the grant application. And all of a sudden things are happening. And I didn't need any community engagement at all. I didn't need any public discourse or anything. How does that happen? So this notion of you need all this big bundle of people to make things happen, I'm not buying that. So that structure of the, how we use community engagement as permission to come down to the neighborhood and do things, that's nonsense. But that's the only method that urban planners know how to use. So what do you do? Hope that helps. Probably more confusing. Huh?
definitely more to think about.
So when I brought up those examples, those are examples that I was really working on. We actually won a Complete Streets project because I sat on those processes of regional funding at SACOG. And was actually on those review teams and saw how the grant process worked and how subjective it was. And so now we went back, reframed our grant, gave it to the city because the city has to submit it, and said, here's what we want you to submit, because they weren't going to write it up. And all of a sudden it's got wheels on it. So we won the actual design portion of the grant. And so I don't know what the neighborhood's doing now, but at least they got the money to start the plan.